Hey guys, so tonight we're diving into something that sounds kind of ridiculous when you first think about it. How much power could a person possibly have just by dressing the king? I mean, they're literally just picking out his clothes, right? Wrong. Dead wrong, actually. Throughout history, the people responsible for dressing the monarch, the valets and chamberlains and personal attendants, they held an astonishing amount of influence. These weren't just servants fussing over fabric and buttons. They were confidants, advisors, kingmakers in some cases. They had access to power and information that would make modern-day advisors jealous. They were in the room when no one else was. They saw things, knew things, that could topple empires. So, before we get into this wild story, hit that like button and subscribe if you dig historical deep dives like this. Let me know in the comments who your favorite royal valet or chamberlain would be. And seriously, the access these people had to the crown is absolutely wild, absolutely unbelievable when you think about it. So, let's dive in. Think about it for a second. When you wake up in the morning, who's the first person you see? Your family, maybe? Or you're alone. You're groggy. You're in your underwear. You're not really at your best. You're vulnerable. For a king, that first person in the morning was almost always his valet or his chamberlain, the person responsible for dressing him, grooming him, preparing him for the day. That intimate proximity, that daily ritual of undressing at night and dressing in the morning, created a relationship unlike almost any other at court. Kings could hide behind masks with advisors, with diplomats, with courtiers. But you can't really hide from the guy helping you into your breeches at dawn. These dressers saw the king in his most natural state. They witnessed his moods, his habits, his physical condition. Was he limping? Was he unusually angry? Was his hand shaking? A keen valet would notice everything. And more importantly, in a world without phones or emails or any real privacy, information was currency. And these men had access to information that generals and prime ministers didn't. The physical act of dressing a king was also deceptively powerful. What the king wore mattered. It mattered enormously. Appearance was politics. It was propaganda. It was a statement of power, health, legitimacy. The clothes a king wore could signal strength or weakness, favor or disfavor towards certain factions. And who decided all that? The person dressing him. If your valet suggested you wear crimson today instead of blue, if he recommended jewels or discouraged them, if he insisted certain garments made you look stronger or more imposing, he was shaping public perception. He was literally dressing the monarchy for the world to see. In some cases, this person would actively advise the king on what to wear to specific events, not just from an aesthetic standpoint, but from a political one. How do you want to appear at this gathering? What message do you want to send? The valet was part strategist, part fashion consultant, part therapist. Consider the logistics alone. A royal wardrobe was vast, expensive, and required meticulous management. Hundreds of garments, each one tailored specifically for the king's body, each one carrying symbolic weight. The maintenance, the storage, the organization, the repairs. This was managed by the valet and his team, which means he controlled access to the king's wardrobe. He knew which clothes were being worn, which were being avoided, which were falling apart. He could suggest replacements. He could recommend new fashions. He could effectively shape how the monarchy presented itself to the world, one outfit at a time. And because the king relied on him for these recommendations, The valet's opinion carried weight. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about looking powerful, looking legitimate, looking like you deserved to wear the crown. During the reign of Louis XIV of France, the most powerful valet in European history was probably a man named Alexandre Bontemps. Bontemps was the premier valet de chambre, which meant he was in charge of the king's personal chambers and his dressing. This guy had so much power that courtiers actually feared him more than they feared some of the official advisors. Why? Because Bontemps controlled access to the king's private time. He decided when the king would be available, who could interrupt him, what his schedule would look like. He was there when Louis woke up and when he went to bed. He was essentially the gatekeeper to the most powerful person in France. And Louis XIV trusted him so completely that Bontemps became indispensable. He accumulated wealth, titles, and influence that made him one of the most important men at Versailles. He wasn't officially a minister. He never commanded armies. But his power was real, tangible, and absolutely terrifying to the ambitious nobles trying to get the king's attention. Here's the thing about royal valets that most people don't realize. They often came from relatively humble backgrounds. They weren't nobles themselves. They couldn't rely on family connections or ancient titles. Their power came entirely from their relationship with the king, from their competence, and from their discretion. This meant they had to be extraordinary at what they did. They had to be intelligent enough to understand the political currents flowing through court. They had to be emotionally intelligent enough to read the king's moods and adjust accordingly. They had to be trustworthy enough that the king could confide in them without fear of betrayal. And they had to be adaptable enough to navigate the treacherous politics of royal courts, where one wrong move could end your career or your life. A valet who lacked these qualities wouldn't last long, but one who possessed them, he could become one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. The valet's influence extended into areas you might not immediately think of. Health, for instance. The valet would know if the king was ill before anyone else. He'd see symptoms, watch for signs of weakness or disease. In an era where a king's health could mean the stability or collapse of the entire nation, this information was explosive. A valet who reported the king was weak or sickly could trigger palace intrigue and succession planning. A valet who kept quiet could preserve the facade of strength. He was making decisions about what information got out and what stayed private. He was, in effect, shaping public perception of the monarch's fitness to rule. Moreover, valets often had knowledge of the king's personal life that would be considered scandalous. Romantic interests, illegitimate children, private habits and preferences. A valet with integrity would keep his mouth shut. A valet who wanted leverage could use this information to secure favors, money, or protection. The power dynamics were staggering. Let's talk about the practical power, the day-to-day influence that a valet wielded. The king's schedule was controlled by his valet. What time did he wake up? When did he want to see certain advisors? How long would he spend dressing? These seem like small things, but they were enormous. If you were a minister hoping to catch the king's ear, you needed the valet's cooperation. You had to get on his good side. You had to convince him that your business was important enough to interrupt his morning preparations. A valet could advance your position or completely freeze you out, and the king might never know the difference. He'd just assume you weren't worth the king's time, that your petition was unimportant. The valet was the ultimate gatekeeper, and his decisions could make or break careers. The valet also had a unique kind of honesty with the king that few others could manage. When courtiers interacted with the king, they were performing. They were adopting the formal behaviors and courteous language expected in royal presence. But the valet, he was often too close, too familiar for much of that performance. He might be one of the few people who could tell the king the truth without it being considered insubordination. If the king's hair looked terrible, the valet might actually say something. If the king was making a foolish decision, the valet might risk pointing it out. This kind of honest counsel from someone close to power was invaluable. Kings surrounded themselves with yes men, but a good valet could be different. He could be trusted to speak truth, and that made him extraordinarily important. The political factions at court were constantly trying to place their own men into positions of influence. A valet loyal to a particular faction could become a spy, reporting back on the king's moods, plans, and conversations. Alternatively, a valet who played it neutral could become wealthy as various factions tried to buy his loyalty. The valet represented a unique opportunity for influence because his position was so intimate and so trusted. Unlike an obvious advisor or minister who would be watched carefully, a valet could move through the palace almost invisibly. His comings and goings would be unremarkable. His conversations with various courtiers would raise no suspicions. He could gather information, spread rumors, or deliver secret messages without drawing attention. He was, in many ways, the ultimate agent of influence. During the reign of Henry VIII of England, the king's valets and gentlemen of the Privy Chamber became increasingly powerful. These men had direct, daily access to Henry. They knew his whims, his obsessions, his fears. When Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, it was partly through the influence of certain courtiers and valets who encouraged his affections. When Henry later turned against Anne, it was often through whispers from those same intimate servants. They could shape the king's opinions by constantly exposing him to certain ideas, certain people, certain perspectives. They were like a constant whispering influence in his ear. And Henry, despite being one of history's most powerful monarchs, was remarkably influenced by these men because he trusted them and spent so much time with them. The valet's power also came from his role in maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and stability. Kings were, fundamentally, performing the role of king constantly. They had to look the part, act the part, embody the role. The valet was helping with the first part, the looking the part. He was ensuring the king appeared strong, capable, legitimate, worthy of the crown. If the valet failed at this, if he allowed the king to appear weak or foolish or unkempt, the entire mystique of monarchy could be undermined. This responsibility made him essential. It made him powerful. It made him someone the king had to rely on and trust completely. Now let's talk about what happened when a valet abused his power or fell out of favor. The consequences could be severe. A valet who became too ambitious, who tried to influence the king too openly, who was seen as manipulating rather than serving, could find himself stripped of his position and cast out into the world. Sometimes he'd be lucky enough to escape with his life. Sometimes he wouldn't be so fortunate. The power of the valet was entirely dependent on the king's continued favor. It was ephemeral in that way. But while it lasted, while the valet had that favor, his influence was absolutely real. There's a tendency to think of royal courts as being run by the officials with fancy titles and official responsibilities, the prime ministers, the chancellors, the military advisors. But the reality is far messier and far more intimate. Real power flowed through relationships, and the valet occupied a unique position in those relationships. He was trusted when others were suspect. He was present when others were excluded. He knew things that others didn't know, and he had the ear of the king in ways that few others could match. Let me tell you about one particularly interesting historical figure who managed to convert his role as a valet into genuine political power. His name was Antoine Coiffier, and he served under King Francis I of France. Coiffier started as a relatively minor royal servant, but he gradually accumulated more and more responsibility and influence. He became so trusted by Francis that the king began consulting him on matters of state. Coiffier was involved in diplomatic negotiations, in the selection of other courtiers, in major decisions affecting the kingdom. He accumulated wealth and lands through his influence. He married well and established a family of power. All of this stemmed from his initial position as someone close to the king, someone the king saw every day, someone the king had learned to trust implicitly. By the end of his career, Coiffier was effectively one of the most powerful men in France. But his power had originated in the intimate privilege of dressing and attending to the king. The relationship between a king and his valet was often deeply personal. It could include genuine affection. It could include the kind of bond that formed between two people who knew each other deeply and completely. Some kings treated their valets almost like family members. They confided in them, relied on them for comfort, trusted them with their vulnerabilities. This kind of relationship created an enormous amount of power for the valet. The king might make decisions partly to keep his valet happy. He might grant favors or titles partly out of affection. The valet had transcended the category of servant and entered into something more complicated and more powerful. But this also made the valet's position precarious. If the king's mood changed, if the valet made a mistake, if he somehow fell from favor, he could lose everything overnight. He had no official position to fall back on, no ministry or agency that would protect him. His power was entirely personal, entirely dependent on the king's continued favor. The valet had to be constantly careful, constantly aware, constantly managing the relationship with skill and tact. It was a high-wire act, and the stakes were enormous. The physical environment of the royal bedchamber was also significant. This was considered the inner sanctum of the monarchy. Only the most trusted servants were allowed entry. The valet was among the very few people who had regular, unrestricted access to this space. He knew how the king slept, whether he had nightmares, what he ate in the morning, what his private habits were. He could see injuries or signs of illness that the king might want to hide. He could observe the king's genuine personality stripped of all courtly formality. This access was not trivial. It was the kind of access that created profound knowledge and thus profound power. There were also financial rewards associated with the position. A royal valet could accumulate significant wealth. He might receive gifts from the king, regular payments, land grants, or titles. But more than that, his position made him a target for bribery. Courtiers and foreign powers would try to pay him for information or for his influence with the king. A shrewd valet could use these opportunities to become quite wealthy. Of course, if he was caught accepting bribes or betraying the king's trust, the consequences would be catastrophic. But the temptation was always there, and many valets found ways to benefit from the numerous people trying to gain their favor and cooperation. The evolution of the role over time is also worth noting. In medieval times, the valet was more purely a servant, focused on practical tasks. But as courts became more sophisticated and complex, the role evolved. By the time we get to the Renaissance and the early modern period, Valets had become something more like advisors. They were selected for intelligence and competence, not just for physical strength or menial skills. They were educated men, men who understood court politics and diplomacy. They were expected to be witty, cultured, and capable of engaging in intelligent conversation. They were, in many ways, closer to modern-day personal advisors than to servants in the traditional sense. The valet played an important role in the transmission of information throughout the palace. He'd be gossiping with other servants, with courtiers who wanted to stay informed, with various factions competing for influence. He might spread rumors that benefited certain causes. He might suppress information that could be damaging. He was, in effect, a node in the information network of the court, one of the most important nodes at that. Information was power in a royal court, and the valet had access to information that few others possessed. Let's consider the experience of waiting on the king from the valet's perspective. You're waking up before dawn so you can help the king wake up. You're seeing him at his most vulnerable, most irritable, most human. You're helping him into his clothes, which requires physical closeness and familiarity. You're straightening his hair, adjusting his collar, ensuring he looks presentable to the world. Throughout the day, you're watching him, noting his moods, his reactions to different people and situations. You're constantly thinking about what he needs, what he wants, what might please him or upset him. You're learning to read him like few people ever could. You're becoming attuned to his rhythms and his preferences. And in the evening, you're helping him undress, perhaps listening to him unwind, hearing his genuine thoughts without the filter of courtly protocol. This kind of constant, intimate attention is the basis of enormous power and influence. The role of chamberlain, which was often closely associated with the valet's duties, could be even more explicitly political. A chamberlain might be responsible for the entire royal household, for the organization of the palace, for the management of servants and resources. A chamberlain with the king's trust could effectively run the day-to-day operations of the monarchy. He could influence everything from who had access to the king to how much money was spent on various royal projects. His authority flowed directly from the king, and his power was limited only by the king's willingness to delegate to him. Some chamberlains became incredibly powerful, wielding influence over matters of state and international diplomacy. The relationship between the valet and other courtiers was complex and often tense. Ambitious nobles and officials knew that the valet had access and influence. They treated him with a kind of respect and deference that his official position might not have warranted. They curried his favor, asked his advice, tried to gain his support for various causes. This created an interesting dynamic where someone technically lower in the hierarchy had practical influence over people technically higher. The valet might be consulted on matters that properly belonged to the domain of ministers or generals, simply because he was known to have the king's ear. One of the most fascinating aspects of the valet's power was that it was often invisible to the outside world. Foreign diplomats and visiting nobles might not fully appreciate the influence of the royal dressing room. They might focus their attention on the obvious centers of power, the ministers and generals and chancellors with grand titles. But astute observers understood that real influence often flowed through more subtle channels, through the daily interactions in the king's private chambers, through the accumulation of small preferences and habits shaped by a trusted servant. Understanding this dynamic required a kind of political sophistication that not everyone possessed. The valet's knowledge of the king's body was also significant. He would know the king's health better than the royal physicians in some cases, simply through daily observation and intimate care. He might notice signs of aging, disease, or weakness that could affect the king's ability to rule. He might be called upon to help conceal these signs, or alternatively, he might be pressured to reveal them to various factions at court. He could become a kind of informal health advisor, his observations carrying significant weight because they were based on direct personal knowledge rather than formal examination. The training of a royal valet was no trivial matter. It required years of education and apprenticeship. A valet needed to understand textiles, garment care, court protocols, languages and customs of European powers, heraldry, and the science of color. He needed to understand psychology well enough to read people and adapt to moods. He needed discretion, intelligence, loyalty, and physical grace. Not every person could succeed in this role. The successful ones were carefully trained and selected. This matters because the valet was not a random person, but a carefully cultivated professional whose skills and knowledge were genuinely valuable. The aging king presented a particular challenge and opportunity for the valet. As the king grew older, weaker, less able to maintain the appearance of power, the valet's role became even more critical. He might use tricks of tailoring, lighting, and presentation to make the king appear more vigorous than he actually was. He might coach the king on how to move, how to hold himself, how to present the illusion of continued strength. He was, in effect, helping to maintain the mystique of monarchy even as the physical reality of the king deteriorated. This was an act of loyalty to the king, but it also extended the valet's power and importance by making him essential to the continuation of royal authority. When a king died and a new king ascended to the throne, the valet faced an uncertain future. If the new king kept the valet on, his power could continue uninterrupted or even increase. If the new king dismissed him, he might lose everything he had accumulated. Some valets managed to survive multiple successions by being adaptable, by quickly building relationships with new monarchs, by demonstrating their continued value. Others found themselves cast aside when political winds shifted. The valet's power was as dependent on historical chance and the specific personality of the monarch as on any institutional position. Throughout European history, the position of the royal valet remained one of the most potentially powerful positions at court, even though it was rarely recognized as such by those outside the palace. The valet was part servant, part advisor, part confidant, part strategist. His influence flowed through the most intimate channels of royal life. He shaped appearances, modulated access, whispered counsel in the king's ear at moments of vulnerability. He was simultaneously essential and disposable, powerful and precarious. He occupied a space that was uniquely positioned to affect the course of kingdoms, and many did exactly that, even if history often failed to remember their names. So, when you think about power in a royal court, don't just focus on the people with fancy titles and official responsibilities. Think about the valet. Think about the person who was there at dawn and dusk, who saw the king without his mask, who had daily opportunities to influence the most powerful person in the kingdom. Think about how something as apparently simple as choosing what someone wears could actually shape the course of nations. The power of the royal valet reminds us that influence doesn't always come from the most obvious sources. Sometimes it comes from proximity, from trust, from the accumulation of small decisions made in intimate spaces. And sometimes the most powerful person in the kingdom is the one holding the king's clothes, choosing his jewelry, and timing his morning meetings. That's the real power hiding behind the velvet curtains of royal chambers throughout history. So there you have it. The seemingly simple position of royal valet contained within it the potential for extraordinary influence and power. These men were not just servants. They were kingmakers, advisors, confidants, strategists, and political operatives. They shaped monarchies from within, one carefully chosen outfit at a time. And while history often forgets their names, we can recognize their legacy in the countless decisions they influenced and the subtle ways they changed the course of nations. The next time you think about power and politics, remember that it doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers from the dressing room of the king,